Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Oh, well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was kind of caught off guard. It was almost feeling like it was just getting warmed up, and then it just was over there. So I am kind of shell-shocked a little bit, Honourable Speaker, as I'm trying to gather myself to make sure that I can say some coherent words to the Lobbyists Registration Amendment Act Bill number 54, Honourable Speaker. And I think that it is important just to clarify that that the Attorney General, if my memory serves me correctly, did at least I think stand in this House and talk about how there was going to be further amendments coming forward to the Lobbyists Registration Act. The amendments that were made last fall, certainly I remember speaking to those amendments and suggesting that they didn't go far enough, and as one of the things that we talked about was actually further amending and asking the government to make further amendments. And so I don't know that this is necessarily. I think that there is something that needs to be fixed here, as was pointed out by the office. But nonetheless, I think that it's not correct to suggest that the Attorney General is scrambling to make further amendments. That was certainly suggested that it was going to happen. The BC Green Caucus does welcome this bill, and it's a part of a broader approach that we believe in improving trust in our government. And this process in the Lobbyists Registration Act is something that we talked about, the BC Green Caucus, the BC Green Party candidates talked about in the 2017 election as part of the reforms that we would like to see under a much broader democratic reform platform that we ran on. This process to amend the Lobbyist Registration Act was a process that, as was part of the confidence and supply agreement that the member on the opposite side of the House talked about. This is part of the negotiation and the agreement that we have made with the government, that we take a look at this bill, and we're quite happy that we are having this discussion and this debate in the House about strengthening the lobbying regime in British Columbia. So I'm pleased to speak in support of Bill 54. I think that it does make significant strides, Honourable Speaker, to improve transparency of lobbying and to strengthen the lobbying regime in British Columbia. See, reforming our lobbying regime is a critical step, it's a critical part of restoring people's trust in government. And it was certainly an issue that I heard on the doorstep over and over again, Honourable Speaker, that people's trust in our government had eroded substantially, and this was an important part of a reestablishing trust in government, making government more accountable in the decision-making process, and strengthening the integrity of the decisions and the trust that people have in the decisions and how government decision-makers are advancing public policy, where that public policy's genesis is. And it's a part of a suite of measures that we have undertaken alongside the BC NDP government, which include banning corporate and union donations from elections and from recall campaigns, Honourable Speaker. So I do want to talk a little bit about the process of how we got to where we are. Implementing lobbying reform was part of our platform, as I suggested in 2017. We felt that it was a part of restoring people's faith in government, and it undermined our democracy and people's trust in their elected officials. So it was a critical part of the work that we did. We need greater transparency, we need greater accountability, and this is one part of that. So after the election, we negotiated lobbying reform into the confidence and supply agreement. It really was on the table of all the discussions that we were having after the 2017 election. It was an important part of our campaign, and it was an important part of the conversations with both the then BC Liberal government and the BC NDP. And as it's British Columbians can see quite clearly, forms a part of our confidence and supply agreement. And in the confidence and supply agreement, the government committed to to do three things, Honorable Speaker. They agreed to institute a multi-year prohibition on lobbying for former senior public office holders, increase penalties for violations of the Lobbyists Registration Act, and initiate a comprehensive review of the Lobbyists Registration Act, including the Office of the Registrar of Lobbyists, the mandate of that office. Government acted on the first two commitments this time last year. The member member opposite was talking about that. They implemented a 2-year ban on senior public office holders from becoming lobbyists. And this was an important step to close the revolving door, as has been said, between government and the lobbying industry, and to protect against people being able to use their inside knowledge and relationships as lobbyists to have undue influence on government decision-making, Honorable Speaker. But this on its own isn't enough. After these initial changes in line with our agreement, government undertook a more comprehensive review of the Act, and that was certainly a part of the part of the discussion that I was excited about, that the Attorney General was going to take a much deeper look at this Act, and that was definitely in line with the agreement and the confidence and supply agreement. And we see the results of that, Honorable Speaker, in this bill that we have before us today. So in this bill, in Bill 54, will make meaningful and substantive changes on how lobbying is allowed to take place in British Columbia, and I'm glad to see that the Registrar of Lobbyists is supportive of these changes. The current registrar and registrars before him have made a number of suggestions on how to improve our lobbying regime to make it more transparent and ethical, but until now, Honorable Speaker, their recommendations have largely been ignored. And our regime in British Columbia has lagged behind other jurisdictions in Canada. And so perhaps the most significant change made in this bill is the change to the reporting regime. A key shortcoming in the current regime is the fact that filers are not required to differentiate between intended lobbying and actual lobbying. And I think, when I talk to my constituents and when I talk to British Columbians about this, they really can't believe that there isn't that differentiation made and that former governments haven't closed that gap. Because it's significantly hampered the transparency around what lobbying actually takes place. Many lobbyists currently put everyone they might possibly lobby, making it impossible to see what lobbying is actually happening in this House. We can't tell who's lobbied who, or when, for how long, or on what they've lobbied that person on. And that is being fixed in this bill. And we're very, very thankful for that. And I think British Columbians be very thankful for it as well. Because there's no doubt that lobbying and that lobbyists bring important information. The meetings that I've had with lobbyists, the government relations people, bring us important information on a daily basis. The 87 members of this place can't possibly know everything about every issue. And so when government relations folks bring their clients in and they educate us. But it's important that British Columbians have access to the information that they need to know who those people are and when they were here and what impact they might have on public policy that's being developed in this province. So now lobbyists will have to file an initial registration outlining who they expect to lobby and about what. And significantly, they'll also have to file returns each month describing the actual lobbying that took place over the past month. These monthly returns will include a lot of information, including the name and position, title of the senior public office holder who was the object of the lobbying activity. This includes ministers, ministerial staff, MLAs, MLA staff, senior ministry staff, their prescribed position in the provincial entity. The date the lobbying took place, the names of the lobbyists who participated in the lobbying activity, and particulars to identify the subject matter, whether the lobbyist made a political contribution to the MLA or political party. All this information is very, very important information in a transparent and accountable government, and I am very, very happy, and my colleagues are very happy that this government is taking the initiative to make sure that this change is coming forward. The change will greatly increase transparency, as I said, and it will make this registry actually useful, which, you know, when we set up a registry, when we set up a bureaucracy like this, I think one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is this bureaucracy useful? And I think that in the past, it's been limited in its use, and the registrar has pointed out how it can be strengthened and how it can become more useful, and that's fallen on deaf ears up until now, Honourable Speaker. And this change has been called on by the registrars. It's been called on past registrars before the current one, and this legislative amendment change brings us in line with other jurisdictions like the federal government, Honourable Speaker. Now, this bill also makes some other significant changes as well. It removes the 100-hour threshold that now exists for in-house lobbyists. And I think that, well, one of the things where I think I disagree with my colleague from the official opposition on this, this doesn't, this 100-hour and 50-hour change, so there is currently a 100-hour threshold that allows a significant amount of lobbying to take place without being subject to reporting requirements or any of the other provisions of the Act. This change is in line with recommendations from the BC Registrar of Lobbyists. We'll be changing that threshold to 50 hours. So small businesses and small organizations, as was highlighted by the member of the official opposition that spoke to this, will still have a significant window to be able to undertake their lobbying activities under, but they won't have the 100 hours. It will be cut to 50 hours, which should be more than enough. And it's certainly the BC Registrar of Lobbyists, the Federal Commissioner of Lobbying, the Ontario Registrar of Lobbyists, and among others, have supported this change, Honourable Speaker. There has been some criticism of this decision to provide this lower threshold for some organizations, but in all, I and my colleagues believe that it's sensible to make sure that we aren't being too burdensome on very small organizations that don't exist for the sole purpose of lobbying. Again, this is not these businesses' sole purpose. They do other work, they do other great work, and it's important for them to be able to have access to the government decision makers to provide their information, but it's not the primary reason for their existence. But we will be having the discussion further and asking further questions about this with the Attorney General in the committee stage. This bill also clarifies the definition of the lobbying for consultant lobbyists to reduce compliance anxiety, and it also closes a loophole that became evident over the summer, as was aptly pointed out by my colleague across the way. Before, the definition of public office holder technically only covered former employees of former ministers, meaning only former employees of former ministers were covered by the Act, including the 2-year ban on lobbying. But if you used to work for a minister who is still in office, you weren't subject to the ban. So clearly this was a mistake, and it wasn't in line with the policy direction that we or the government wanted to go. And so the Register pointed this out this summer and asked the government to fix this loophole, which they're doing with this legislation. And so we're thankful for that. This bill also requires a disclosure of a number of things that were previously hidden from the public. Lobbyists will now be required to report if you're lobbying on a contingency basis, who the ultimate client is, and any third parties with a direct interest in the outcome of lobbying. And anyone who donates a certain amount of money to the lobbying effort, this will also be clarified in the regulations, is my understanding. So contingency fees, and this is an important one, which I don't know that British Columbians know much about, but this is a payment that is made dependent on whether that lobbyist is able to secure a certain result for their client. And the government has chosen to take a middle road. Instead of outright banning the contingency fee contracts like some other jurisdictions have done, the BC NDP government opted for requiring disclosure of contingency fee contracts, which is a middle road approach, as I said. And there has been some criticism. We acknowledge the criticism that's been made. And we'll be asking more about why the government chose to take this path instead of an outright ban in committee stage. Under this new act, you'll also have to declare if you adhere to a code of conduct, like the Federal Lobbyist Code of Conduct, the Law Society Code of Conduct, or other professional standards that exist out there. So if you're a lobbyist, you'll have to let the government know if you already have a code of conduct that you have have sworn to uphold. And we, the BC Green Caucus, wanted this this legislation to direct the registrar to create a code of conduct themselves for lobbyists. So this is not quite the approach that we would have taken. However, I think the government is acting on many of the elements that would be in a code of conduct in this bill, such as requiring the disclosure of contingent fee contracts, requiring identification of third-party interests, and regulating gift giving. Government has chosen to prohibit gift giving except in certain situations where it's incidental to protocol. An example of where gifts might be allowed is part of a customary ceremony or an event. I can think of First Nation ceremonies as an example in which you would be given a gift and it would be problematic for you not to be able to receive that gift. Final substantive change that government is making with this bill is increasing the power of the registrar against people who break the rules in the Act. And of course, as we know, Honourable Speaker, if you don't have a strong ability to enforce and to enforce the rules, then what do you have? And so this change is in line with our agreement to increase the penalties for violations in the Act, and we're quite happy with that aspect of it. So under this change, the registrar will be able to impose a ban on lobbying for up to 2 years if they determine a grave and repeated failure to comply with elements of the Act. This change actually adds a significant tool for the registrar to enforce compliance, Honourable Speaker, and we'll be asking more about that in the committee stage as well. So in conclusion, we're happy that this the second phase of amendments to this very important piece of legislation is coming forward in this fall session, and to point out this was a piece of work that we had talked about last fall. We started last fall, and that we talked about continuing, and so we're very happy that it indeed has continued, and we're quite happy. The BC Green Caucus is quite happy with the direction that government is taking, although not entirely the things that we would have done. Certainly happy with the direction. As was pointed out, lobbying reform was an important element of our platform in 2017. We believe that we needed to clean up the lobbying that happens in this place, that British Columbians have a level of confidence that the kinds of decisions that are coming forward from public policy are influenced by stakeholders and by people by British Columbians, but that they understand what events took place in order for public office holders and decision makers to get to that decision. And so these changes that have been outlined, I think, are very, very important. We've been criticized, I think, for having some of the laxest rules, and now I think that we're modernizing our lobbying act, and we're getting ourselves into a position now where we are comparable, if not leading the country, in our legislation. And again, we want to be able to be transparent, to be accountable, and that the people of British Columbia are confident in the work that we're doing in here and how we arrive at the policy decisions that we get to. So with that, I'll take my seat, and I'd like to thank the Attorney General for bringing this legislation forward, and we're quite happy to support this bill, and we have some questions in committee stage. So thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Thank you, Member.